Hey guys, your friendly death investigator, and welcome to this is the official Autopsy Podcast YouTube channel. It's actually been here a minute, but this is the first of a bunch of content that I want to start doing for this channel. Um, just for if you don't know, whenever you're watching this, I used to just put up the podcast itself on this channel just for a little bit more exposure. But I'm probably going to slowly take those down. So by the time you even watch this, they may not be there anymore. Podcast isn't going anywhere. It's available wherever you get your podcasts. Um, but I wanted to do something a little bit different. The podcast actually takes a lot of time to get into, to write and make sure that it's sound. Like I put a whole lot of time into making sure that everything is as accurate as it can be. So that's why it's about one episode a month. But I want to do more intermediate content like this, more stuff topical to what's going on day to day. And that's where we find ourselves today. Um, and today we're going to be looking at the Jeffrey Epstein case of a recent thing that came up. Not Epstein himself. If you don't know, like I've done a whole episode on Jeffrey Epstein at this point. I did a uh, a deep dive essentially. It's on the podcast. You can go find it. It's what I call the autopsy minus autopsy. It's like 70 minutes or more of me just deep diving into everything Jeffrey Epstein. And in that, I talked about these guards. And one of the things that we're going to get into about them that what happened, excuse me, what happened recently is all the charges were dropped against the guards who were supposed to be watching him that night. And when you read these reports, and I pulled up two main ones, I pulled up, this one doesn't count the first one you're seeing here, but I got this CNN article and this New York Post article. And these are about the best that I could come up with. And they're not even that great, but they're indicative of kind of what's out there and what people are sort of getting wrong about this case, or at least being somewhat, I don't know if it's willfully inaccurate what they're doing, but they're leaving out like key elements. But whatever, we'll get into it. But first of all, who are Jeffrey Epstein's prison guards, Tova Noel and Michael Thomas? So if you weren't aware of who they are, they're both listed as corrections officers. But as we find out, it doesn't say which one specifically, but right here, one of the guards who did not primarily work as a correctional officer was working a fifth straight day of overtime. The other guard was working mandatory overtime, meaning a second 8-hour shift of the day. And this is the kind of stuff that I don't see enough people reacting to. People want to react and say it's all like conspiracy related. They want to deep dive into that angle of it because it's the most fun to dive into as far as Epstein goes. And while I do love the memes, if you've listened to the show, if you've listened to the episode I did about Epstein, you know that I'm exceedingly hesitant to refer to it as a homicide. I just based on my experience, I lean more towards it looks and feels like a lot of suicides I used to deal with. That doesn't mean there's not things that are kind of questionable. It just means like overall the evidence like really points to if you pay attention. And again, go check out the episode. But in it, I talk about these two, and one of them not being an actual guard. And again, it doesn't say which one it was, but the big point I want to point out or allude to that I talked about in the episode that I want to get to here is the idea of bureaucracies and how like they're so short staffed at the MCC. The MCC, as far as I know right now, is closed. I don't know if it's permanently closed, but I'm pretty sure it's closed. They can't get staff. They probably, and it's federal prison, but it's not like Club Fed. It's not the super night. When people say, federal prison, some folks will get the idea, especially when it's involved Epstein, that it's something that it's not. Um, so this was kind of a hellhole in Lower Manhattan, the MCC, where Epstein was being kept, and these people were basically probably underpaid and overworked. Fifth straight day of overtime, and one was doing mandatory overtime. Means you don't have a choice in the matter, does it? And people neglect this a lot. Now, This article is from right here, May 22nd of 2021, so last year. And again, I had to go pick it because the stuff you're going to see are the CNN and the New York Post articles. These are from, about a week ago when this story dropped. But they don't mention any of this. But if you deep dive, or you don't even deep dive, but when you go looking for this stuff, it's all there if you want to see it. And I have theories on why everything was ultimately dropped. But let's see, let's get right to it. I actually have it highlighted right there. You probably saw. But what essentially happened about a week ago is the Ghislaine Maxwell case basically wrapped up. I don't know if she's been sentenced yet, but she was ultimately found guilty. But a few days, maybe a week before all of that, the charges were dropped against Noel and Thomas, the two guards. And people found that, suspicious. And it's like, well, I could see that. I could see where people would think that. It's certainly, anything's sort of possible. But whenever you sort of look at this case as a whole, I will say they got off exceptionally light. Because one thing, I always knew that they, one of them was not a guard, that they were working overtime. They weren't doing their rounds. That's the most important thing. When I say they got off light, I empathize with being overworked and underpaid, and by having to work for a bureaucracy that couldn't care less about you, because that's what, when you're a corrections officer, I did corrections a decade ago. It was horrible, and that's why they don't care. You're a warm body to them. That's a pet peeve. But these two they weren't doing their rounds. And while I empathize with them, I also, they're supposed to be doing half-hour checks. You're looking at, probably one of the most high-profile cases that you may ever have to deal with Epstein. So maybe get up and do your checks. He had also been on suicide watch, but he was not on suicide watch whenever he was found deceased. He had been taken off about a week before. And you wonder, again, just because I'm given benefit of the doubt, you sometimes wonder, were these two even told, he was on suicide watch? Obviously, they knew he was high profile, but did they know he had been on suicide watch and then taken off? That's important stuff to know. I'd like to think it was communicated, but you never know, because that's the big thing with bureaucracy, is they don't communicate. So ultimately what they're getting is they're avoiding jail time and subjected to supervised release, and are required to complete 100 community service hours. Again, I think that's a little light. No jail time at all. I mean, I have a theory of why this isn't happening, and it's very non-conspiratory. I don't want to be coy with you guys or lead you on. My mind just doesn't quite work like that. But here, records indicate the two admitted that they willfully and knowingly completed materially fake or false count and round slips regarding required counts and rounds. They were, let's see, sat at their desk just 15 feet from Epstein's cell, shopped online for furniture and motorcycles, walked around the unit's common area instead of making required rounds every 30 minutes. And it does say, now, I knew one of them had been asleep. I didn't know both of them had been asleep, but this is according to an indictment. But it does say during 1 2-hour period, both appeared to have been asleep. I assume that means they were both asleep at the same time. It doesn't really detail, and I don't really know. But again, I worked in this environment, and I saw lots of guards. Where we had it, I wasn't with federal, but we rarely had like 2 corrections officers in a unit or in a wing. So that said, like I knew lots of people that were in the middle of the night, they would just fall asleep. The corrections officer would. Happened all the time. Um, so that doesn't really surprise me. And I'm not saying, I'm not really defending them on that level. That's kind of, if someone's going to fall asleep, you would at least logically think, well, they're asleep. I don't need to fall asleep. That's potentially bad. When we did it, like we fell asleep, but when I worked it, it was a very rare thing if someone ever died kind of on your watch anyway. But if you were doing your rounds, doing your checks, it wasn't really on you, as long as you did the best that you could do. With them, if they're both asleep and they're not really, it says they're walking around the common area. If you know the case of Epstein where he was staying, you could walk around the common area, and sort of look in and kind of be able to see in through the glass and see what everybody was doing without actually having to walk up. Now, you should walk up. I mean, that is your job. You should be doing it. But the big takeaway is they were both asleep at a certain point. At least that's what it alleges here. And they basically said they were doing the rounds when they weren't doing the rounds. But going back to when I worked, like if you did your stuff and somebody died on your watch through no fault of your own, you were in the clear. But here it's slightly different because while I empathize with them, there's just something that's like, well, if someone dies on your watch and you were asleep during that and you weren't doing what you were supposed to be doing and then lied about it, 100 hours of community service is really, really getting off exceptionally easy. And I feel like I understand why that's going to happen if we go down. And it's all legal and HR stuff because, they were hit with federal charges. But right here, if we'll look, Noel's attorney states, the shortcomings and mistakes made by Miss Noel were a result of inexperience, lack of proper and sufficient training, and being put in a position to fail by the leadership of MCC and the Bureau of Prisons. This is where, like, if you try and be conspiratorial and say, oh, they dropped the charges, they just want this to go away, it's like, no, they don't want to get sued by Noel. I don't know what kind of leg Thomas has to stand on, but they're sort of in it together. They were working together. And if I had to guess, I don't know which one wasn't an actual guard, and that's important. They were both, this is how terribly staffed this place was. They were both working overtime, and one of them was working overtime, basically assisting a corrections officer being made to work as a corrections officer when that wasn't her job. She did not, like, from the way I've always understood it, and if it's Noel, then that's the one I think that's who it is, but I don't know for certain. But regardless, they didn't start this job to be a corrections officer, but they were so short-staffed and this place sucked so hard that they were just asking people or forcing people maybe to say, hey, you're going to have to start doing this to help these people out because we don't have the staff. And then the sort of unstated thing that they would never say is we don't have the staff because we don't pay that well and our hours are horrible and this place kind of sucks. That's why. So they basically probably give you a crash course in training. Just do this. You're just assisting this blah, blah, blah. It's not that hard. It's not that bad. But then they constantly need help and you're constantly doing overtime. And then you have people, even though she's on her 5th day of overtime, the other Thomas is on mandatory overtime. That's how, like, again, think about how short-staffed you have to be that someone is on their 5th day of overtime and then the person you're working with is on mandatory overtime. That's insane. We were always short-staffed where I worked, but it was never, I mean, that's pretty next level. It doesn't excuse falling asleep and having someone die on your watch completely, but it does make a whole lot of sense when you see these people are overworked and they're not properly trained, and that's what's ultimately going to make people question, make federal judges throw out charges and just give them a lesser, like, they didn't completely get off clean, Some people would argue 100 hours of community service is getting off clean, and you have, there's some argument. I don't know. I feel like if my point, my sort of interpretation of this was always, if they gave them prison time, um, they would likely, two things would happen. They'd probably appeal it, and they'd probably get off. They'd probably walk. That it would not be hard for these two to appeal, any kind of guilty verdict, and yet it would have to go to trial. And if they were found guilty and sentenced, they would probably appeal it, and they'd probably walk, because again, in proving that they deserve to be found guilty is its whole other thing, especially when you start seeing how overworked they were and what a kind of hellhole this place was. This is where I sort of look at it and I'm like, oh, this is human resources. This is Toby from The Office saying, hey, we don't want to deal with this on the federal level. This is let's leave these two alone, because if we charge them and they're found guilty, they'll probably walk, and then they'll countersue us, and they'll probably win. Because they can absolutely prove that these people were that they were overworked. I think they can prove that easily with records. As easy as it is to look and see that they falsified records, it's just as easy to say, oh, these people were overworked. If it was Noelle that wasn't the actual corrections officer, she was overworked. She was inexperienced, and probably the MCC probably didn't care. She was just a warm body to them. And that's the kind of unstated thing that kind of probably saved both of their butts in the end. If I'm like, that's what this reads to me is, if we find them guilty, we might be in more trouble than just let them admit their guilt. If they admit their guilt, then we're not going to charge them, and we'll just make a plea deal. They won't do any time, but they will do community service, and that'll be that. So they don't completely skate. They do have this on their record now, but they don't actually do jail time. And that was the thing. I was like, if someone dies on your watch, maybe there is a part of me that thinks maybe jail time, a little, a month, couple of months, I don't know, a little bit of jail time for negligence wouldn't be the worst thing. But if they do any kind of jail time, I would almost guarantee they would probably sue the MCC, and they'd probably win and get a settlement. And yeah, this is HR. This is, again, the older you get, the more you realize Michael Scott hating Toby in The Office was so justified. But yeah, that's my sort of take on it. If you want to get conspiratorial, I didn't really get into the New York Post. It basically says the same thing. They falsified the record. Yeah, it's basically just the same thing. But again, this New York Post and this CNN article, they're essentially the best versions of everything's out there. And even they are leaving out this stuff from the U.S. Sun, an article from, a year ago, a little less than a year ago, that explains who they are, what their kind of predicament was. And these things, this is where I think like news media, they intentionally leave this stuff out because they know it feeds. Because Epstein is like, if you're right wing or left wing, Epstein is the case that kind of joins these people together, and everybody, it's a conspiracy. Both sides, it's a conspiracy. So you'll see right wing media, left wing media, and CNN is left wing media. New York Post is kind of right wing. I don't really know. New York Post is weird. I have kind of opinions about it, but some people would say it's right wing, and it may very well be. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, they're both giving essentially the same story, but they're leaving out this kind of stuff where it's like, context does matter. And if you actually thought about this stuff long enough, you'd maybe be a little like, oh, I sort of see why this is the way that things are. This is kind of how the world works, unfortunately. And I think that's all I got for this, guys. If you want to see more content like this, leave a comment. If you think I missed something or you want me to go over something, let me know, and I'll, future stuff I may do. This may take the place of the discussion episodes on the podcast, but we'll see. You never know. If if people want to see this and I get into this and I get enough support where I can actually do this full time, absolutely, I'll do any little thing that I can, anything you guys want to see. But otherwise, find me on patreon.com/autopsy podcast. The podcast will always be on Patreon, ad and promo free, and you'll always get early access to the podcast as well as this kind of content. I'll always post it there at least a day or so earlier for you folks that support to have. But otherwise, yeah, thank you guys for listening, and until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.